Longplay 4K Review, Silent Hill 4, The Room. This time, I'll dispense with a complete retelling of the story and focus more on my relationship with the game. 4, no matter how you slice it, SH4 doesn't stand up to direct comparison with any of the previous games in the series. The Room is not Silent Hill. It's anything but a continuation of every single game series. What to say, if the game doesn't have Silent Hill at all, and the hero is in trouble in some Ashfield. This town is supposedly located not far from the Pacific Hill. But if the writers wanted to point out the proximity of the hero to the town, why didn't they choose Bram, which was mentioned by Sybil in the very first game? There are a million of such questions in the course of the game, and there are two ways to answer them. So, first way, trash the game for retcons and spitting on the legacy. The second way, pretend that this is exactly how the developers intended the game to be originally. A standalone project called The Room. Does it really need to be? Konami shot themselves in the foot by naming the game Silent Hill. If we choose the former, the game is disappointing as a part of the series in the first place. Despite the fact that it can be justified by its originality, like Silent Hill 2, SH4 remains underdeveloped, undertaught and dragged out. If we choose the second point, it's just a passable game for a couple of evenings, but still just as underwhelming and pointless. It's under such unpromising circumstances that we'll start to remember what this very room was all about. Henry Townsend is a nobody. He's not affiliated with a cult or looking for a relative. He wasn't called to the city as a sinner. He's just a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He has no personal arc or motives. His existence doesn't affect any global lore. Harry killed Samael, he doesn't suffer from reflexivity over something important, James, and he wasn't born to Ailsa, Heather. He's just a man who woke up in a locked apartment with no way to get out. In his place could have been a wasted alcoholic who would have died before Sullivan completed his ritual. Oh, that's Sullivan. We'll get back to him. Henry's hard to empathize with, hard to like. But there's nothing to hate him for either. I wrote in the reviews on SH1 and SH2 that Harry and James stop being surprised by their surroundings very quickly. Henry in this regard is the quintessence of coolness. He doesn't even try to pretend to care about what's going on around him. Lazily getting out of bed, he just as lazily gives the exposition that he has been sitting locked in the apartment for 5 days now. We don't see the hero's attempt to break the lock or smash the window. We only learn that the phone and TV don't work and have to accept as fact that for 5 days straight Henry does nothing to save himself. Writing a letter and slipping it under the door, of course, is not an option. And what's even funnier, the game has already given us exposition about the same thing before Henry's story. How? With a wall of text on the screen. This is some amateur level. Not the familiar development studio team Silent. Even when a hole in the wall forms in the bathtub, for some reason it's on the 5th day, Henry doesn't take long to climb into it. You should have stuck your hand in the toilet, explorer. My problem is that the hero is locked inside his own apartment and seems as calm as possible. So much so that the appearance of a hole in the wall surprised him just enough for him to climb in like nothing happened. It doesn't look like a desperation move. It's like Harry killing a giant, bitchin' moth the size of a building and not saying anything about it. Hello, did you even realize what happened? For some unknown reason, Heather from the threequel is the only one in the series who reacts to her surroundings much more vividly. And also more than once per game wonders what's even going on. The cheesiness of her surroundings brings her to the point where the heroine starts making jokes about it. How did the developers catch a wave by the 3rd game and blow it all again in the 4th? Finishing with Henry. You can justify him, he's an avatar and should be feared first and foremost by the player. How often do you worry about a character in an MRC? Well, Henry has his name, and even has a hobby of taking photos. So Henry is a character in the story, not a player avatar. The second character is the apartment. And that's the best part of the game. Its heart. A small apartment that can be freely explored from a first-person perspective. The apartment is both an island of respite and a source of story development. at least in the beginning. Henry can look through the peephole and watch the neighbors, save the game, put things in a drawer, and peek at his neighbor Eileen through a hole in the wall. Almost every return here triggers some new scene or event. By the way, since I touched on this topic, let's talk about the changes in gameplay. Since the game is divided into levels, there are almost no riddles in it. Mostly it is a collection of keys from the doors behind which lie new keys. In addition, the inventory is now limited to 10 slots. Because of that, the amount of backtracking to and from the apartment triples. At the same time, each key and each cartridge clip occupies 1 slot. Uncomfortable. All firearms except the pistol and revolver have been dropped from the combat system. Now the hero 90% of the time waving melee weapons. Golf clubs, bats, knives, axes, pickaxes, and so on. Why they made a bias towards melee combat, which has always been a crapshoot in the series, is not clear. Henry also learned how to make an amplified blow with a weapon. Press the button and the character, having prepared, strikes with increased force. Almost useless thing, as enemies will hit faster than the scale is charged. In the second half of the game, ghosts appear in the apartment and they scare very, very well. The corpse of a cat meows in the refrigerator, or a ghost comes out of the wall. Through the peephole you can see both Sullivan and dead Henry. A distinct and varied horror attraction, in short. The only one in the game. No other location, no other game situation, is as frightening as the apartment. But the enemies can. Some. The already seen dogs and pesky immortal ghosts that victimize the villain are pretty good. The two-headed kids running around on huge arms and pointing fingers in the hero's direction is creepy and creative. The macaques. I beg your pardon? What macaques? With golf clubs? Are you out of your mind there, Team Silent? What does that mean? That people are like monkeys to Sullivan, dumb and always yelling? SGS is over there. No, it's not surrealism. That's laziness. Maybe even a spit in the face defense used to enemies meaning something within the game. Macaques, for fuck's sake. And the wheelchairs? And the so-called patients? They don't mean anything. Sullivan can walk. Sullivan wasn't a patient in the hospital. Sullivan. Who the hell is Sullivan? He's a character in a newspaper excerpt from Silent Hill 2. You know, when James is looking for the coins from the closet. He sees a newspaper in the trash and it mentions Sullivan, who killed several people, and when he was arrested he committed suicide with a spoon. Again. Sullivan killed himself with a spoon. In prison. In SH4 it turns out he killed himself in the next room of Henry's apartment. Even if you include the SRSG and believe it wasn't the real Walter, it turns out that both the police and his former classmate didn't outwardly recognize the same Walter? That's absurd. Moreover, towards the end of SH2 we find Sullivan's grave. Moreover, the events of SH4 take place in 2001. About 7, maybe 10 years after SH2. Sullivan has already been dead for a shitload of years. Even if you turn on the SBGS and assume that the graves in SH2 give insight into who dies in the future, it begs the question, why did James even need to show that grave? Why did the player need it? What kind of death is this delayed by as much as 10 years? The developers thought they were being creative by creating a major SH4 antagonist out of the N30-something newspaper character of SH2, and they screwed up big time. Doing an entire lore retcon for the sake of a character whose first mention is in Musica is either stupidity or negligence. He was already scrapped in SH2, which symbolizes his unimportance in the story, but they pulled him out, resuscitated him, and said that this Sullivan is just as cool as Alessa. He can create parallel realities and his own gods. Yeah. Walter Sullivan can create parallel worlds and devil gods, too. Because there's no other way to call that thing at the end of the game. You know how Sullivan got his superpowers? According to the fandom wiki, a priest of Valdiel's sect and the Order, mentored Walter and taught him the ritual of the 21st Sacrament, for which he let Valdiel, the Order's angel, into Walter's subconscious. The presence of this demonic entity in Walter's subconscious probably gave him some supernatural powers. You get it, right? Vault Deal, Heather's personal guide from Part 3 gave Walter Sullivan superpowers. You know where that information came from? From the book Lost Memories, not the game. I don't care what some book says. I'm looking at what the game gave me. I'll ask you more. Why did Delia need to summon a god when the members of the Order could openly summon other beings to help themselves? And I know why. Because by the fourth installment, the lore had completely fallen apart. The scriptwriters did not try to connect the events of the first and second games, giving theories to the fans. Say, Samael died and now his spirit calls sinners to the city, a strained theory, which at least somehow explains the connection between irrationality in the original and sequel, which personally suits me. But in the fourth game, they also add Sullivan to the mix, who completely ruins any hold on lore logic with his ability to create parallel worlds. Sullivan's existence completely devalues Alessa and Samael. And this lost memories thing. These things are written when the writers themselves no longer understand what's going on and are trying to tie everything together. In short, the developers themselves made confusion among the fans in SH2, and in SH4 they finally got confused in their own writings. And it would be possible to simply recognize that there is no canon at all, each game is a free interpretation of the magic of the city. Or to leave the lines of the sect and sinners in parallel and not to link them in any way. As a result, we have a character with superpowers coming out of nowhere and with the dumbest possible motivation. Sullivan wants to reconnect with his mother. His mother, in his mind, is the apartment where Henry lives. In order for that to happen, a special ritual must be performed. The Order has a ritual that allows you to merge with the apartment. Find yourself a barn and merge with it, damn you. As the game progresses, we see the murders of the remaining people. Cynthia from the subway, a junkie from the woods, a guard from the juvenile detention center, and a tenant from the same apartment as Henry. What's a juvenile detention center? It's where they put naughty people from the orphanage nearby. A children's prison in a touristy fucking city. How did no one see that? Who cares if it's in the middle of Toluca, literal description located somewhere on Toluca Lake. It's impossible to keep silent in a town that has a historical society with a city history. The latest victims are Eileen's neighbor and the protagonist himself. However, for some real reason, Sullivan didn't finish Eileen off and starts chasing her and Henry through all worlds. God, what a thrash. The main villain, who up until those moments was some sort of mystical and obscure character, spends the entire second half of the game acting as an immortal enemy who literally runs after the heroes and shoots them with two-handed pistols. Samael, we blew it. These worlds, as Henry calls them at save points. There are 6 levels in the game. Yes, levels. We don't have the city and its haunted houses that we visit. We now have a hole in the bathtub that consistently takes us through locations. Why it takes him to locations where Sullivan kills his victims I don't know. I also don't know why the hole takes the hero to Eileen's hospital. All in all, it's a bit snaggy, but acceptable. The apartment proves to be the strongest point of the game and yet has weaknesses. The hero can't leave the apartment, but he has to get to the levels somehow. Put it this way. We explore each of the worlds and watch the deaths of the victims. At a certain point in the story after rescuing Eileen, as I wrote above, the heroes start being chased by Sullivan, and the player has to go through all the locations again. And to further infuriate the player, Eileen starts walking with Henry, who needs to be protected if you want to get a good ending. At the same time, ghosts start appearing in the apartment. You can get rid of them by using special candles. When this game designer mayhem with backtracking through half the game ends, we finally leave the apartment. To go through one more of the previous levels and only then get to the final game. If you cleared the apartment of spirits and took care of Eileen, then during the final battle you can take your time and calmly kill Sullivan's mom and himself. In a snaggy melee, Henry slaughters the supervillain and the nightmare ends. Especially for the player. I dislike SH4's story so much, but I love the game's apartment atmosphere so much. The peak of domestic horror in the series was reached here, but there was only enough potential for this small location. Symbolically, Team Silent disbanded after the fourth game. Symbolic because the number 4 means death in Japan. It's hard to deny that after the release of the original, the developers couldn't cope with their own canon and started rewriting it to suit their own creative ambitions. Yes, it turned out great, but only in isolation. But it was SH4 that was the apotheosis of the retcons as represented by Sullivan. The first trilogy are good, great games. But the fourth, alas. By the way, here's an info on copies sold of the game series. From 1999 to 2006, 5 million copies were sold, of which more than 2 million went to SH1 and more than 1 million to SH2. I believe SH3 and SH4 sold 1 million or even less copies. I couldn't find the exact figures. Which is saying something. The era of Team Silent ended on a sad note. They released an atmospheric, but creepy game, to which they stuck the name Silent Hill for some reason. The most disappointing thing is that the development team was not given a chance to rehabilitate themselves. Let's remember. Henry, bring flowers. As much as I love The Room, every few years I rewatch the entire quadrilogy. The quadrilogy, because no other game in the series has been able to do something like what Team Silent has done in their games. Create a believable atmosphere of domestic horror in a twisted reality.